Hi, everybody. This is real weird. I'm recording this for you. My name's Dr. Allyson Jackson. I'm a professor of environmental studies at Purchase. So normally I get to see you guys in class and see everybody who's taking Bio 2, and I really enjoy that. But this year, as we've all been dealing with, we're all at home. So I've got my helper on my lap today. This is Buddy the dog, who will probably jump off pretty soon, but he's very needy. So I'm going to talk to you guys about conservation biology. I'm going to do this kind of in 3 recordings, and then I'll be available on Zoom next week to kind of talk to you guys. So basically, you can find me Purchase email address, or I have Jackson Ecolab on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. So let's get started. So this is part 1, why study conservation biology. So what is conservation biology? It's basically this applied science that seeks to learn how to preserve species, communities, and ecosystems. So I really like it as a science because of the fact that it unites kind of both things that you learn in basic biology that you're learning in Bio 2, and then really applied management. So we're looking at fields of study like wildlife and fisheries and agriculture that are really looking to figure out how to solve some of these problems. And then where those two unite is basically conservation biology. So you need to know the basics of biology and then also kind of how biology interacts with the real world. So who are conservation biologists? It can look like a whole bunch of different things. So professors, wildlife biologists, wildlife technicians, but then there's also a ton of veterinarians, zookeepers, farmers, people who do education and outreach, science teachers, videographers. There's kind of a lot of people that all are trying to help with this conservation related science. So maybe it could be you. That's kind of my little pitch for today. So why do we need conservation biology? The important thing to realize is that right now we're in the middle of what we call the 6th mass extinction event on Earth. This extinction event has been caused by humans, and it means we're losing species at an alarming rate, much faster than we would expect. Aren't extinctions natural? Basically, there's this great book written on this. It's called The 6th Extinction in Unnatural History, that basically sets up this whole case for, yeah, some extinction is natural. We have what we consider background extinctions, but the rate and the magnitude at which the extinctions are happening now is completely unnatural and caused by humans, and therefore our fault. So if you're looking for another book to read, reading or listening to this book is a really good idea. It's a little depressing because it's all about kind of the case for why humans are at fault here. But I found that by reading it, I was much more able to talk to people about this and feel informed. So this idea of mass extinctions versus background extinctions, the idea is that we do expect, just because of natural selection and changes in diversity, that there would be kind of a background level of extinction that would happen. But what's happening right now in terms of the observed versus the expected number of extinctions is that we're spiking in all different taxa. So mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fishes. We're seeing much higher rates of extinction than would be expected just by what happens over geologic time. And this isn't the first time that we've undergone, as a world, mass extinction events. So we have throughout, obviously, 5 previous extinction events. One of these, very familiar to you, is probably the KT mass extinction, where we lost all the dinosaurs, probably because of an asteroid. But the difference now is that we can figure out that it's human influence on the fossil, on what species we're losing. So throughout time, you see these mass extinctions in the fossil record. Many are caused by major changes in the Earth's climate. The one that killed the dinosaurs was because of an asteroid hitting and then changing Earth's climate dramatically. All of these extinctions caused big changes to Earth's flora and fauna. But the big difference here is that the 6th one that we're going through is caused by humans. So both in a habitat destruction type way and climate change way. And we'll get to that in part 2. So I wanted to talk about 2 case studies of recently extinct species and talk about why they went extinct. So these two very cool species went extinct in the 1800s. So they were recent enough that we have even specimens of them in museums. So one was the great auk, which was basically a penguin-like bird, but it lived in the northern hemisphere. So we would have seen it swimming in the Atlantic Ocean. It went extinct because of its breeding strategy, where it breeds primarily on rocky islands in the middle of the ocean, which was great for it. It didn't have any predators on those islands, and so it was really a really safe place until human sailors started going through those islands and realizing that they could pick up auks, even the adults, and especially the eggs, and use them as food. Came to the point where they were also using them just as fuel. They could burn them because they're really fatty, like little fatty penguin type things. And so because of this and because of taking its eggs, this species was driven to extinction. The dodo was another bird, this one on a different island, where it had been isolated from humans for so long and from other species that it basically became flightless and had no natural predators, so it had no fear of mammals. So when humans came to the island, this one, the dodo, was not scared of them, and so it wouldn't necessarily run away. And this also allowed humans to kind of overexploit it and use them for food, but they had no way of rebuilding their population. So why are island species so vulnerable? Usually I would use this time to talk to you guys about this, so hopefully we can talk about this more during our Zoom session. But the idea of island species being vulnerable is because they've spent a long time undergoing natural selection to kind of adapt them to their island environment. And if their island doesn't necessarily have a predator on it, that means that maybe they've lost their ability to fear predators, because that was not an adaptation that was needed on their island because they never experienced predators. So that's one of the things. Also, just in general, they tend to be endemic to those islands and don't have really big population sizes. And so in general, we do worry about island species around the globe, including these ones that we've already lost, but there's some island species that are currently dramatically declining as well. So when we're talking about conservation, we often kind of get the question, well, like, why does it matter? So researchers have grouped what a species is worth into kind of 4 basic categories. And so we think of this as this value that we can assign to species and ecosystems. So the first one is a direct use value. So this is products harvested by people, such as timber, fish, and things like that, where we're getting an actual use out of whatever the organism is. Indirect use values provide current benefits to people, so we're using them, but it's not in a consumptive way. So I think of these as habitats and trees and plants and things that provide us recreation, education, scenic amenities, that type of stuff. Third is the option value, which is the idea that there might be a future benefit in this organism or this ecosystem, like a new medicine, a new food source, genetic resources that we don't yet know. So we don't see the direct use of it right now, but in the future we might find some really great use for it. And so that's another reason to preserve species and ecosystems. And then finally, the existence value, which is it's a non-use, non-consumptive value that can be assigned to biodiversity. I like to think of it as, how much are people willing to pay to protect a species from going extinct? So this is just the idea that I like to know that certain species exist, and I'm willing to pay some money to protect them. So that difference between direct use and indirect use, think of direct use as kind of things that you can actually consume. So lumber and fish are definitely things that we think of as giving us a direct use. But then there's also kind of smaller scale things, like a lot of people around the globe forage for food for their direct use. So this is like hunting for mushrooms could be something, or using some sort of species that you get to consume. Indirect use is kind of the idea of enjoying nature, and it provides benefits, and in a lot of ways economic benefits, where a lot of areas that are near places like the Grand Canyon or the Caribbean make a lot of tourism dollars for people wanting to visit them, which is of course funny to talk about now during the middle of coronavirus where none of us are going anywhere. But I would also say that for those of us, which is everyone who have been stuck at home for a long time, we're maybe seeing some indirect use value for just nature around us. So if you just have a city park near you, I know I'm going and just sitting in my yard, which isn't very big, much more than I used to, because I just need to see what's going on out there. So those are kind of indirect use values. At this point, I would put a lot of high need on getting out into my yard just to survive this pandemic. So that option value, I want to go back to that. This is like basically, how do we know if a species will help us? If we don't have any use for it right now, maybe there'll be a use for it in the future. And the best example I could think of here was the horseshoe crab, which they actually have copper-based blue blood, which is just cool to see in general. But it has an important quality that it clumps in the presence of bacteria. So this blood has actually been used to test for the sterility of medical equipment and injectable drugs. So it has this very strong medical use for it. And so for now, we want to conserve the species because they haven't figured out a totally synthetic way of making it. But how would we have ever known that if we had let the horseshoe crab go extinct earlier on before we figured out the use for its blood? So that's kind of the option use value. Now it has a direct use. We can actually take this blood and use it. But the idea that before we knew that, keeping horseshoe crabs alive and on the earth would have been an option use value we want to see. So I like to think about all the different things that we're trying to conserve, even if we don't see a direct use for them. Maybe there is in the future a more direct way that we'll use them. And then the existence value, this is kind of more of the hippy dippy side of it, where we just like to see species and ecosystems conserved. I think it's often easier for people to support the existence value for charismatic megafauna, as we call them. And what are they? They're big, they're exciting, they're beautiful. And so they tend to get a lot more kind of pulling on the heartstrings, where even though I've never seen a tiger or an elephant in the wild, I want to see them conserved. I like the idea of knowing that elephants exist in the wild in different places, just because it's such a cool creature. So that's kind of the existence value. So a lot of times we scientists or maybe environmentalists talk too much about just the ecological benefit, but oftentimes there's a combination of ecological and economic benefits. So this case study is shrimp farming in Thailand. And the problem is often that there is the short-term localized profit is at odds with long-term economic gains. So in this area, a lot of mangroves have been converted to these shrimp farms that you can see down here on the bottom left. But the research actually shows that intact mangroves serve a better economic value in terms of reduced flooding from different storms and weather events that end up impacting the communities economically in the long term, versus the short-term gain of turning it into shrimp farms that they can then profit from. The issue is that like people have a hard time thinking long-term in the future, so they end up only working towards the thing that in the short term gets them economic stimulus. And getting people to kind of think long term or to understand people's motivations or what they're doing has led to this whole new field of conservation biology, which is human dimensions research, which I think is really interesting. It combines kind of more the sociology, anthropology, economic side of it to kind of understand, well, why are people making the choices that they make, and how can we convince them or show them that there actually might be more value in this example, saving the mangroves in Thailand. And there's a million examples of this in a lot of different places. Every once in a while, doing the right thing can be the smart financial thing. So this is an example from the New York City watershed, where in the 1990s, they were having a lot of water quality issues for the drinking water in New York City. And they kind of costed out, and they said, okay, to build water filtration plants, it would be $6 billion up front and then operating costs forever to kind of keep the water supply clean from New York City. But if we just went up and protected the watersheds that our water was coming from, and keeping that during its natural process of cleaning the water and then making it available for drinking water use, that would only be $1 billion. So that makes total economic sense. So what it ended up doing was that a whole bunch of land was set aside to basically protect the habitat that was filtering the drinking water from New York City. So I think that's a really cool example of, since we had somebody who could kind of price that out and make the point, it was a no-brainer. And this is the type of work that I think conservation biologists do. They kind of can say, look, like this is the better thing to do. Okay, so I hope that made sense. I'm going to stop here, and then I'm going to do part 2 about issues facing the environment right now.